Hi and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Allbyon to Britannia Book 3, The Last Wizard. The wizard is free, but they need now to go back and rescue Leia and her gran, and the nasty group are on their way to the Triangle to try and kidnap Miss P, who, even though she isn't there, they're going to try and attack her house. So let's see what happens. We're now in Chapter 11, A Rescue Attempt and the Voice in the Garden. I doubt you've ever had to practice making your mum invisible in the back of a car on the North Circular. I couldn't practice on Marco as he was driving. I imagined being called over by the police because we did not appear to have a driver. It was even odd casting a spell in front of my mother, let alone on my mother. My worlds were colliding. We were about 10 minutes away from Bourne Road when Leia texted. BB, Vlad and 3 of gang left 10 minutes ago. Just Hecate and Igor left in the house. I'm locked in attic with Gran. As before, Marco drove round the block so that we ended up a little further down Bourne Road from the house. By that time, I had made my mum invisible and used the spell on myself. I asked Ruth if she would like to be invisible too, but she said she was okay as she was. On the other side of the road, under a tree, we saw a white van parked. That looks like the one on CCTV at the Green Man when they kidnapped SJ, said Marco. I wonder why they're not using it tonight. There was no one in the garden, so Ruth slipped through a gap in the hedge in the corner to make her way around the back. Our plan was to ask the fairies to make their lights and float them up to the windows of the rooms Hecate and Igor were in. Of course, that meant that Mum and I had to find out which rooms those were. As there were only 2 of them in the house, we decided that Marco should stay in the car to be ready for a quick getaway. He seemed quite practised in quick getaways, but would only say that it was a skill he'd learnt when he was young that he seldom practised anymore. The disadvantage of both of us being invisible was that Mum and I could not see one another, so we held hands as we entered through the front gate and walked down the path. Despite having taken Sebastian's book back, there was a warding spell in place, though it was not very strong. Someone must have written it out when they had the book and spoken it from the copy, but not someone with true magic. Sebastian had explained this to me. I undid the warding spell and we approached the front door. I performed the unlocking spell. The lock clicked and I pushed the door open. Well done, Mum whispered in my ear. Shh, I replied. I was worrying that Hecate or Igor were in the front hall. We slipped through the door. There was no one there. Mum closed the door behind us and put her hand on my shoulder. I realised there were voices coming from the direction of the kitchen. As there were only 2 of them there, they must both be there. At first, they sounded as if they were just chatting. I texted kitchen to Ruth. As we crept towards the kitchen, their voices soon changed. I carefully opened the kitchen door a crack. Hecate and Igor were at the window looking out into the garden. Balls of light were bouncing against the glass. I recognised Igor as the man the fairies had surrounded with lights when I took the book, and he was looking very nervous. Hecate's hair was cut very unevenly after her previous encounter with the fairies in the garden. I considered what to do. My first thought was to make balls of light inside the kitchen. However, I saw the key in the lock, quietly removed it, and locked them in from the outside. Upstairs, I hissed to Mum, and we returned to the front of the house and set off up the staircase. It dawned on me that perhaps we did not need to remain invisible, but something made me hesitate to undo the spell. When we reached the landing, I stopped for a moment. Could I hear voices? Was it just nerves? We set off up to the top floor. I like to think now that I was beginning to worry that there might be a trap. For whatever reason, I paused outside the door of the attic room. Mum let go of my hand and put it on my shoulder and stood behind me. I wish there was a spell for X-ray vision like Superman, but if there was, I did not know what it was. So in the end, I either had to call out or just open the door. I decided to open the door. I did not have to use a spell. There was a key in the lock and a bolt. They were both open. There was certainly something wrong, but all I could do was open the door. It swung open. Inside stood Vlad Black, with his left arm around a girl dressed in an old black t-shirt and black jeans. In his right hand he held a knife at her throat. She was a little taller than Ruth, probably older, with short curly black hair. On a narrow single bed there lay an old lady who seemed to be asleep. The girl looked a lot like her. "Whoever you are," said Vlad coldly, "if you try anything, I'll cut her. Show yourself." "I'm sorry," Leia cried. He caught me with a phone and made me send that message. Get out while you can. They're all here in the house. Shut up, Vlad shouted, shaking her. I've got her grandma, the witch. The girl's expendable, so take me seriously if you want her to live. He jabbed her with the knife and scratched her so she bled slightly. I was truly terrified and had no idea what to do. Eddie, Vlad shouted, get the others and come up here. I heard steps coming up the stairs. We were trapped. Then Mum pushed me forward into the room. She took hold of my head and moved it so that I was looking at the corner of the room to our right. There was a rickety old table, but enough room for us to stand behind it if we were careful. I edged forward. We carefully skirted the table and stood in the corner, trying to make ourselves as silent and small as possible. 2 of the mob came up the stairs, followed by Brenda Brown. There's someone in here, but I can't bloody see them, Vlad said. Is it a person, or is it just those effing lights again? I felt safer in the corner and more able to think. I conjured a ball of light and sent it bobbing over to the window. I hoped it would distract them from finding where we were standing, but I also hoped Ruth and the fairies would see it from the garden and send up some lights of their own. Vlad looked at it, but did not move. I conjured some more and sent them off into different parts of the room. Vlad backed himself into a corner, but did not let Leia go. Her gran had opened her eyes and tried to sit up, but one wrist was handcuffed to the bed. She started to complain and call out for Leia. One of the mob poked his head around the door and saw all the lights. He quickly drew his head back. Where's Hecate, Eddie? Vlad yelled. I don't know. She was in the kitchen with Igor. Then bloody well go and get her, Vlad shouted. He sounded rattled, but he also sounded deeply angry. Leia was genuinely in danger. By now, we could hear Hecate and Igor shouting from the kitchen. I wished I'd stayed at home. Eddie and the other man set off down the stairs again, pushing Brenda Brown out of the way. From where we stood, I could just see the window, and suddenly there was a great flock of lights rising from the garden and starting to bump against the glass. It gave me heart, and I had an idea. If I shouted the spell that had knocked them over before, we might yet be able to get out while the rest of them were running towards the kitchen. I took a deep breath. My voice was breaking at that time, and I was scared that a squeak would come out rather than a roar. Leave her alone! For an instant, I thought the voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was a huge voice that reverberated around the room, a deep but female voice that seemed to come through the window from the garden. Vlad instinctively covered his ears and dropped the knife. Leia quickly picked it up, swerved around behind Vlad, gripped him around the neck and pushed the knife in his ribs. Give me the key to the handcuffs, she screeched in his ear. He dropped a key on the floor. Mum spoke for the first time. I'll get it. The key disappeared as she picked it up. She unlocked the old lady's handcuff and she disappeared. I realised Mum had picked her up. Leia's gran was a tiny woman, and my mum was quite fit and strong. Don't worry, I called out to Leia. I felt Mum pass me. I saw Brenda Brown fall backwards as Mum pushed past her. Come on, Leia said, shoving Vlad forward. Give me the excuse to stab you. You know I will. They left the room and I followed. Brenda Brown scrambled to her feet, but Vlad told her to get out of the way. He must have known how badly he had treated Leia and fully believed that she would stab him. Leia forced him down to the first floor landing, but instead of carrying on down the stairs, she pushed him into the bedroom where they had been keeping the book. Give me Gran's pension book or I'll cut your face, she hissed at him. He opened a drawer in an old Victorian desk and pulled out some papers. Leia took them out of his hands. He tried to get the knife from her, but I lunged forward and managed to stop him, though somehow ended up with a cut across the back of my hand, though I was the only one who could see it. By now, Hecate and the mob were standing at the foot of the stairs. I had no idea where Mum and Leia's gran were, but Mum must have moved quickly, because I realised that the front door had opened. Leia was now pushing Vlad down the stairs in front of her. Would the mob let them through, or would they manage to overcome her? I realised that Leia was singing quietly as she walked down the stairs. The mob started to sag at the knees, and I realised that she was singing a sleep spell, like the spell Rose used. They were woozy, but not falling over, perhaps because there were so many of them, or perhaps because she was a young witch. Still, it was preventing them from making much of an effort to stop her. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, she pushed Vlad violently into them and sprinted for the front door. I ran after her. As she opened the door, I turned and shouted the spell at them, and they all fell backwards. Leia and I ran as fast as we could. "Turn left," I yelled at her. "The old Jaguar." "Get in," yelled Marco, and Leia dived into the back seat, landing on my mum and her gran. I leapt in the front next to Marco. "Are we all here?" Marco called out. "Where's Ruth?" I shouted. "We'll pick her up by the stream," Marco said. I quickly undid the invisibility spell, and Mum, Leia and her gran untangled themselves. The old lady was very confused, which was understandable. Mark gunned the engine, and off we shot, as Vlad and the mob spilled out of the house and dashed up the path. We picked up Ruth by the stream. She had to squash into the back with the others. We were soon on the way back along the North Circular. It was only then that I had time to think about what had happened. "Where did that voice come from?" I asked. "It was nothing to do with me," said Leia. "Ruth, you were in the garden. Was it something to do with the fairies?" I asked. "I'm not entirely certain," she said. "One moment there were fairies and lights. They flowed up to the attic window when they saw your light. Then there was something like a whirlwind of fairies, which knocked me over, and then I heard this voice so loud that I put my hand over my ears. When I got up, all but a couple of the fairies had gone. One of them said, 'You must go now, bye-bye.' It was polite, but very insistent, so I went down to the stream like I'd arranged with Marco and waited for you." Whatever had happened, wherever the voice had come from, it was something to do with the fairies, but none of us knew any more than that, and neither did anyone else when we got back home. Ruth went out into the garden to ask the fairies next door, but they just giggled at her and disappeared into the bushes. Sebastian was very angry at himself. The nasty mob had fooled us, and Mum and I had walked into danger. Even though we'd all agreed with the plan and we'd managed to defeat it, he felt responsible. He was as pleased as the rest of us that we'd succeeded in rescuing Leia and her gran, and even her pension book. Having been a prisoner in their house himself, he was relieved that they were now out of the clutches of the nasties. But he did not seem to want to talk to anyone, and decided it was time to go back to his flat with Marco in the car. He took the book of spells, but when I offered him the flash drive, he turned it over and over in his hand, then handed it to me. "You look after it for me. Keep it safe." I was suddenly worried that he wasn't going to come back. "Don't forget, I'm your apprentice." He seemed to be managing quite well without me. "Only with a lot of help from other people, and whoever that voice belonged to. We haven't completely got rid of the nasties. They know where we live." "I need to get my head together, young Miles. I'll see you soon." I followed him out of the house. I wanted to call out to him, "I'm only 13," but he turned away and clambered into the car. I was still worried that I'd never see him again. Rose was behind me. She patted me on the shoulder and said, "Come inside, dear. He does things like this." I returned to the living room and was soon caught up with everyone meeting Leia and her gran. When I told them what Mum had done, and Mum told them what I had done, there were many congratulations. After a while, Rose could see that Leia's gran was finding it all very confusing, so she took her off into Mum and Dad's study to be quiet. She was happy to be out of that attic. She'd been shut there for weeks, being badgered by Vlad and Hecate to do things she could no longer do, even if she'd wanted to. But she did not know where she was now. Rose probably sung a sleep spell over her because she was soon asleep in an armchair. We all found Leia and her gran fascinating, and Father Joe and Rose were amazed to have finally discovered what they called British magic. Over the next few days, while we awaited some response from the nasties, we learned a lot more from Leia about them both. And I think I'm going to save Leia's and Ada's story for next time. So join me then.